Welcome to another Times Radio Frontline recap. Now, I'm going to point you at some of the videos this week and some of the interviews that we've had that I would recommend you watch. But of course, I recommend you watch every interview this week because they're all very good indeed. But before we get to the interviews, there's a couple of clips I want to show you. The first one is US Vice President JD Vance on, I think it's Fox News, talking about how Europe is now buying US weapons and the US are not supplying those weapons to Ukraine for free. And it goes on then to interview General Keith Kellogg, who is the US military representative to the Ukrainian government, and he is talking about the potential supply of Tomahawk cruise missiles. Have a look at this.
Well, one of the things I've always said, Martha, is I wanted the Europeans to step up in a big way. I wanted us, the United States, to stop shoveling money and weaponry to a conflict that was so far away, when I felt like the Europeans, with all due respect for them, were not actually taking their fair share of the burden. Because of the president's leadership, you now have the Europeans buying weaponry from the United States as opposed to us giving it. And you asked this question about tomahawks. It's something the president's going to make the final determination on. What the president is going to do is what's in the best interest of the United States of America. That's the driving light between his foreign policy decisions, between his defense policy decisions, and that will be the same heuristic that we apply to how we answer this question about tomahawks. I'll let the president speak to it, but I know that we're having conversations this very minute about that issue.
I think reading what he has said and reading what Vice President Vance has said, as well as Secretary Rubio, the answer is yes. Use the ability to hit deep. There are no such things as sanctuaries. That's one of the reasons I believe that this last week, and it has been confirmed, that President Zelensky asked President Trump to get Tomahawk missiles, which give you a depth. They're really good systems. America makes the best systems in the world.
Are we giving him the Tomahawks?
Well, that decision has not been made, but he's asked. I know that President Zelensky did, in fact, ask for them, which was confirmed by a social media post by Vice President Vance. That's going to be up to the president to do it.
And the second video that's related to that is the response from the Russian Foreign Minister, Lavrov. And he's expressing surprise about the US decision to potentially supply Tomahawk cruise missiles to Ukraine. Have a look at this.
Я думаю, что это результат, прежде всего, давления Европы на Вашингтон. И Вашингтон хочет показать, что он учитывает мнение своих союзников. Я не думаю, что мы уже имеем дело с принятым решением. Томагавки американцы далеко не всем поставляют. Из европейцев, если я не ошибаюсь, в Испанию и в Нидерланды. Остальным как-то остерегаются. И если они считают, что Украина это ответственная держава, которая будет ими ответственно пользоваться, то это будет для меня удивительно.
Now, it's interesting that it's Foreign Minister Lavrov who is responding. That suggests that the Russians are taking this quite seriously. They're not using their spokesman, Peskov. They're not using someone else to respond. It's Lavrov who has got this wily old diplomatic ability. And that is significant and suggests, and the tone of what he says, the way he says he would be surprised at the United States trusting the Ukrainians enough with these sorts of weapons when they don't trust a lot of other nations with these weapons. And that word of surprise is very careful diplomatic language and downplaying what the potential Russian importance of it as much as he possibly can. But reading between the lines, it's not downplaying it in any way, shape or form. It's suggesting that the Russians are extremely worried. And both those videos push us into the interviews that I want to point you at this week. The first one is from Maxim Tucker. And Maxim is talking about the Russian offensive that broke through Ukrainian lines just north of Pokrovsk and advanced tens of kilometers through Ukrainian defensive lines. Have a look at this clip from Maxim here.
So early last month, the Russians broke through Ukrainian lines towards Dobropilya, and they were moving to encircle the town of Pokrovsk, which they've been seeking to capture for some months now. and looking like they might achieve that goal finally. And this is the kind of culmination of Putin's summer offensive, where all of his resources have been focused really in taking this key garrison town of Pokrovsk. The Ukrainians were in disarray. They didn't know where the neighboring units were. They didn't know how to stop this breakthrough of the line. And the Azov First Army Corps were sent in to reinforce this sector and basically take over the disparate brigades there and coordinate the defense better. And through a very clever active defense and maneuver warfare of the kind we haven't seen really since the Kursk invasion, they established a blocking line to stop the Russian infantry moving any further. And then through flanking attacks, they have created bottlenecks in 3 places along the Russian lines and encircled Russian soldiers, Russian infantry who had moved further than artillery and drone support, and started methodically wiping them out in those pockets. And the brigade, the Corps, has claimed they have already killed in these pockets more than 3,000 Russian soldiers, which is a really significant number of infantrymen. Infantry increasingly hard to come by these days. But not only that, the Russians, not realizing where the Ukrainians had taken up positions, continue to send reinforcements to what they thought were Russian positions, where they were ambushed by the Ukrainians. And the Ukrainians told about how in one case, Russian artillery units being dragged by a truck just drove up to a Ukrainian position, thinking that they were reinforcing a Russian position, and were immediately just wiped out by the Ukrainians. So the Ukrainians look like they are on the brink of a pretty tactically significant victory here. It may not change what happens to Pokrovsk in the long term, but clearly that's been recognized by President Trump in his recent change in rhetoric. And this, we think, is why he suddenly thinks that Kiev can actually win the war if it's given the resources it needs.
He has been thinking and wondering what President Zelensky said to Donald Trump when they were in that meeting on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly. Do you think that this is exactly the kind of thing he was talking about then?
I think the US military is very well briefed on what their allies are doing in Ukraine. And I think they have good information from the ground, and they can see the strategic and the tactical picture very well. So whether Trump was briefed by his own military, he kind of suggests that he's read into it and he's been briefed by his military. This point might have been underscored by Zelensky as well during that conversation. But clearly Trump has changed his mind, and he talks specifically about knowing more about the military situation.
An article that's published in the Times today. It's brilliant in the detail it goes into. Who did you meet when you were in the area, and what did they tell you about this?
So we spent a long time traversing the front lines in the Donetsk area. We've spoken to the chief of staff of the Azov First Army Corps, Lieutenant Colonel goes by the nom de guerre of Lemko. We were in the Azov HQ. You can see the sprawling underground headquarters. It's buried very deep underground. We had to walk down, I think, about 100 meters of tunneling just to get inside it. And it was incredibly labyrinthine. There's different cabinets everywhere, different rooms where different screens and different activities are being carried out. And we could see on the screens actually the detailed positions of the Ukrainians and the Russians, which were changing in real time. And we could see also the drone feeds from different positions where the Russians were being hit. And you could see Russian infantry suffering as they were being attacked. We also went to Dobropilya. We went to a reconnaissance company's headquarters, where we spoke to some of the people on the very front line of this fighting about their experiences. And we spoke to some civilians in these towns as well about how it is to live under constant rocket, missile bombing and drone attacks.
The situation right now in that area is on the battlefield. How many Russian troops are trapped at the moment, and how many casualties have there been, to your knowledge at least?
So they estimate hundreds of Russian soldiers being trapped in these different pockets, and there have already been more than 3,000 Russian casualties in the month since the Azov Corps has taken over. This is the 3,000 figure they say is verified by video. They did show us some videos, but it's impossible to verify that claim altogether. They also said that they had destroyed 28 tanks and nearly 1,000 different pieces of Russian equipment, including over 100 artillery units during their counterattacking. So it does look like something that has been a pretty positive experience for the Ukrainians. We can also see Russian military bloggers expressing alarm at how these hundreds of troops who are still encircled in those positions. And it also does allow some leeway for Ukraine to now make territorial gains of its own and retake some lost positions if it can pursue counterattacks further into Russian-held territory. Of course, the danger is that in any situation where an army is attacking in this kind of war, where there are so many drones in the air, that as soon as you move forward, you become more exposed and your logistical lines are more exposed.
And what Maxim goes on to talk about is how the Ukrainians, with their defensive positions and the static positions there as the Russians broke through, were in slight disarray. They didn't know how to react and how to deal with it. But they brought in the Azov Corps, this new corps structure that the Ukrainians are moving their forces to, who managed to get a maneuver capability, the Azov Brigade, to go in and cut off the Russian breakthrough and then isolate the pockets of Russian troops and then to start to destroy them. And reporting of at least 3,000 Russian infantry troops killed. And we've got 20, 30, 40 tanks destroyed, a significant number of artillery pieces as well, and how this is a significant military loss for the Russians. And actually, it's a demonstration of a significant military capability for the Ukrainians that, the Russians, if they do get a breakthrough, their new corps structure allows them and allows their command and control to be able to deal with the issue that's there and maneuver through using Western maneuverist type doctrine to deal with the threat that's there. That is significant because I think this will stop the Russians potentially from trying to break through in different areas again, unless they've got the ability to follow that breakthrough up with another force to allow them to exploit any weakness they find in a defensive position. That was probably Russia's counteroffensive. Ukrainians have blunted it, have pushed it back, and actually it was to the north of Pokrovsk. It was part of this cauldron that the Russians are trying to put around the city of Pokrovsk. And instead of closing the lips of the cauldron together, what it's resulted in is the Ukrainians managing to open up that gap even further. So it's brought a degree of time, bought more time for the defenders in Pokrovsk. Russia's been trying to capture it for over a year. We're now getting into autumn and winter months. We'll not see much maneuver coming from the Russians again in that sort of area. So Maxim's interviews are always well worth watching. I suggest you don't just watch the clip, go and watch the whole thing, please. Next interview is with Chip Chapman, and Chip is talking about the Russian air attacks. Are they attacks or the Russian air assets going into NATO countries and what's happened before? Have a look at Chip here.
Of course, in 2015, Turkey shot down an Su-24M in its airspace when there was a violation by Russia over the border from Syria, when Russia had gone all in with supporting Assad at that time. Now, of course, one of the things which the Ukraine war has shown us is that Russia's power is not ubiquitous. That's why they couldn't support Assad in the final denouement and were left to be seen to be a paper tiger, the phrase which Trump used last week. But I think what's interesting on that is that although the Turks shot down a Russian aircraft, there had been a series of violations in October 2015 by the Russians, of which on the third time the Turks called in the Russian ambassador. What I might expect to see, because we've now had incursions recently into Romania, potentially Denmark, although Russia was not named, alongside Estonian airspace, is you might see a coordinated diplomatic move in NATO to call in the Russian ambassador in those sovereign countries, so that you've got that coordinated action. And I think the other two things which we've seen are one of the things that Putin is seeking to do by this is to stress test NATO and to see what their collective will is. The first thing you'd say is that having stood up NATO very quickly after the Poland operation, an operation called Operation Eastern Sentry, which is both more aircraft, more surveillance, more radars, and more ground-based air defence. That is a positive thing, quickly done. And this week we've got significant EU meetings in Denmark, and and Denmark is also going to receive troops before that meeting on Thursday, I think, both from Germany, France, and Sweden. That's radar, anti-drone capabilities. So I think everything that Putin tries to do seems to go against him. So at the moment, looking at the collective will of NATO, the thing he's trying to break, it only seems to make it stronger. There are interesting peripherals on this of all the countries involved. So, for example, the incursion into Estonian airspace. Estonia don't have any of their own fast fighter jets, so they rely on forward deployed NATO capability. Therefore, the decision to engage in Estonian airspace would be for NATO to take, in the way that it wasn't, for example, in Turkey, where airspace is sovereign in peacetime under the Chicago Convention, but Turkey took its own sovereign decision to shoot down a Russian aircraft, but was supported by NATO very, very quickly, in the same way that Poland, Denmark, Romania have also been supported very, very quickly. So I think at the moment, I would say that the plus side of the ledger is with NATO, how they've reacted, not with Russia, which looks to be in the minus category on the ledger.
And as part of these supposed Russian incursions, Kiev is claiming that Moscow is now launching drones from Shadow Fleet tankers. Obviously, we've seen operations like that, Operation Spiderweb, before, where where drones were launched from trucks. How seriously do you think commanders in Europe are going to be taking that threat, the idea that Russia could bring in a weapon system like a drone using a tanker?
Well, I think they should. It's really to do with either Schengen or the open borders and what level of checking you have and how your intelligence goes. So I don't think there should be any complacency on this. I think what's interesting on the Denmark side is that there's actually a air defence surveillance frigate going to surveil Danish airspace. So one of the potential things that happened was a Russian ship launching drones. That would be picked up, it seems to me, by the German capability. I think it's the FSG Hamburg is the platform which the Germans have put to secure that part of the Danish airspace for the duration of this week at least.
And how should Europe be going about countering drones? I mean, we're now hearing that Ukrainian soldiers could end up training Polish soldiers on how to, shoot down drones using interceptor drones and things like that. Is Ukraine now, because of its experience in this conflict, one of the only European countries that has a real and tested anti-drone system, rather than having to rely on more traditional things like very expensive jets?
Well, the speed of innovation is the thing we've been looking at the last few years. And it's where the speed of innovation comes from both the Ukrainian side and actually from the civil sector, which has been supporting Ukraine and how that's been working. So from a UK perspective, for example, we've had the UK task force Kindred, which has been providing the bulk of our support via the Ramstein format to coordinate the support to them. But we had this thing announced a few weeks ago, Project Octopus from the Brits, which is a sort of anti-drone capability to drone hunt in terms of the Shaheeds. But one of the things we're also seeing is the commercialization of the battle space. So, for example, one of the capabilities given to the Ukrainians is under a program called White Stork being the Ukrainian national bird. That has been a program which was actually stood up via Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google, who's looking at using AI incorporated into anti-drone technology to hunt Shaheeds. So it's not just the fact that it's Ukraine doing this. They are being given pretty decent capability. But like all these things, the people who operate them in a combat situation are probably the people to go through to train other people. They have the realities of this on a day-to-day basis, in the way that the armies of the West, who obviously aren't fighting because deterrence still works at the moment, don't have that sort of qualitative and quantitative data that people on the ground do.
And the example that Chip's using is the Russian incursions into Turkish airspace as the Russians were operating out of Syria for Bashar al-Assad. And he emphasizes the fact that there was a number of Russian incursions into Turkish airspace that resulted in warnings going out to the Russians, and the Turks actually calling the Russian ambassador in to give him a formal statement to say that they were displeased at it. It's a good old British stiff letter. And threatening that if they did it again, they would be shot down. And then a Russian Su-24M came into Turkish airspace again and was shot down within a matter of seconds or minutes. And that didn't result in a war between a NATO country and Russia, and it didn't result in Article 5 having to be called. It resulted in the Russians backing off. So that's what we need to do in Europe. Chip talks about that and talks about how actually the Russian air probes into European countries are a sign of weakness, and showing that Russia is actually what Donald Trump describes as a paper tiger, because they don't have the ability to generate combat power to come and threaten Europe in any other way. So they're using their air assets, the Shahad 136 drones that went into Polish airspace, the drones that we're seeing over Denmark, Sweden, Germany and elsewhere from Shadow Fleet shipping. They're using that to probe NATO and to probe Europe and watch the diplomatic reaction and watch the military and security reaction to those, and to try and keep pressure on European nations to stop supporting Ukraine by forcing them to focus on other things. But he emphasizes several times how Russian power is waning, its military capability is waning, and that's a very important piece to bring out. And then final video that I'm going to point you out today is an interview I did on Monday with General Mick Ryan, and Mick is talking about how the US attitude has seemingly changed, and General Kellogg coming out emphasizing Donald Trump, US President's increased support for what Ukraine's doing, and the fact that Donald Trump said that Ukraine could potentially win. Have a look at this.
Well, General Kellogg's view is a welcome one, although for many analysts that's been the view for probably a year now, that it is not possible for Russia to win this war at the moment. They have neither the ground or the aerial capacity to do so. Their large-scale aerial terror attacks against the Ukrainian people are not cowering the Ukrainian people. It's only making them more determined to not be occupied by Russia. But it does represent a shift in the narrative, in the rhetoric from the Trump administration in the United States. And indeed, we've seen that from Trump himself in the last week, who's talked about what has been an aimless war from the Russians and the sanctions that have caused gas lines. And even JD Vance, the US Vice President, in the past 48 hours has been rolling out a very similar narrative about the Russians not wanting to negotiate, not wanting peace. So this is potentially a very major shift by the Americans. But, words are one thing, action is another. And if the Americans really believe that Russia can be pressured to come to the peace talks in a way they can't at the moment, they're going to have to step up with more weapons and a whole range of other support to Ukraine on top of what Europe is doing.
Well, on the action side of things, we ever since Ukraine announced the development and use of its Flamingo long-range cruise missile, we have seen sustained attacks against Russian critical oil and gas infrastructure, against its railway infrastructure, against military command posts and elsewhere. And it seems as if Ukraine is stepping up these targeted attacks. Do you think they're having the desired effect? And do you think that it's got Putin properly worried?
I think it really does. I think the Ukrainians in 3.5 years have gone from zero long-range strike capability to perhaps one of the most effective ones in the world. I mean, clearly America probably has the most effective, but the Ukrainians have developed something using, exquisite technologies as well as very simple technologies that I think is far more effective than what Putin is doing to Ukraine. It is forcing the Russians to announce that they will no longer export oil products. They've got such a shortage. You're seeing shortages extend to the fuel pumps now in Moscow. This will put even more pressure on Putin. He's got to be very worried. And to give the Trump administration some kudos, they have not been pressuring the Ukrainians to hold off on these long-range strikes, unlike the previous administration who suffered from escalation terror. It's clear that the Trump administration, whilst they may not be providing tomahawks at this point, have not been stopping the Ukrainians for striking deep inside Russia, which is exactly what they need to do at this point of the war.
Now, do you think the Russian tactics that we're seeing across Europe in particular at the moment, where we're getting lots of reports of drones over critical national infrastructure in different countries, Germany, Denmark, we've seen Sweden, and drones over military infrastructure as well as the incursion with the Shahad drones into Poland and cruise missiles going through Romanian airspace, as well as activities around undersea pipelines by Russian spy ships and shadow fleet. Do you think this is Vladimir Putin upping the ante and trying to expand the conflict in a way that you're getting NATO countries to have to focus on different things? And you in your article mention NATO's war on Russia. At what point do you think that the provision of long-range weapons combined with the Kremlin's tactics could become a red line that would mean that we're going to see a direct engagement between NATO forces and Russian forces?
Yeah, I mean, we need to be clear. NATO is not at war with Russia. I use those words quoting Lavrov in my article. But I think what Russia is doing is a demonstration of Russian weakness, not strength. Putin cannot afford to engage in a larger conflict in Europe. He picked a fight with Ukraine, which has an economy 10% the size of Russia and a population 1/4 of it, and is unable to win that war. Europe and NATO has an economy orders of magnitude beyond Russia's, has a military that's vastly more powerful. What Putin is trying to do here is have Europe back off and not support Ukraine. He cannot, if he picks a fight from Europe, win such a conflict. He is just in such a weak position at the moment. So we need to see these attacks for what they are. They are a sign of Russian weakness, not of Russian strength, and it calls for determination, pushing back, and enhanced deterrence against Russian threats.
And General Kellogg, he understands and is a wily, experienced old general, understands completely what's going on. And he does turn around and re-emphasize the fact that Ukraine could win and push Russia out. He emphasizes the fact that Russia can't win in the ground. He emphasizes the fact that Russia has, whilst on paper, theoretically, it is a powerful military power, it can't and hasn't been able to generate sufficient combat power to win on the ground in Ukraine. And he again emphasizes that Putin is in a very weak position. And like what Chip Chapman was saying, he suggests that the grey zone attacks that are happening across Europe, these drones, the cyber attacks, the threatening undersea cables and other things by Russian shadow fleet tankers or by Russian spy ships, are all a sign of weakness, a sign of Putin's weakness. It's going back to what Chip Chapman said, this Russian paper tiger. And I think that's significant because it's that has, I think, forced Donald Trump or suggested to Donald Trump that he should change his attitude, because Donald Trump only likes to be supporting the winning side. And I think he thought, from looking at the balances of forces on paper, that Russia was going to be the winning side. I think he's come round now to realize that no matter what Vladimir Putin says, and no matter what it looks like on paper, actually the Ukrainians are going to be the winning side. And I think that's a good thing. It's not necessarily going to translate into greater US support, but if it means that the US doesn't turn off the support that it's giving at the moment, and is still continues to be happy to supply weapons purchased by European nations to be supplied to Ukraine, and then takes the gloves off to allow longer range weapons to be used to military effect across Russia, that's significant, and that's a significant move forward. we'll know in the coming days and weeks whether that happens. But once again, I recommend you go back and watch all the interviews this week, because I hate picking one or two out because they're all so good. But thank you for watching this week's recap. If you want exclusive access early to our videos and our interviews, please sign up for Times Radio membership. And of course, you can get us in any of your favourite podcast channels just by searching for Times Radio Frontline. Thank you. Goodbye.